Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, June 22nd, 1990, Nelson Mandela visits Boston, Massachusetts. The South African freedom fighter had recently been released from prison just in February of that year and now was on a 6-week, 13-nation tour, which included a bunch of stops in the United States. Mandela would become the leader of the African National Congress later that year and then be elected president of South Africa in 1994 in that country's first multiracial elections after decades of apartheid. But this trip in 1990 in the United States, and this visit to Boston in particular, came at a really interesting moment for Mandela and the international struggle against apartheid. So here to discuss are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Kellie, I mentioned this, but Mandela's released in February. By late spring, he's on this massive worldwide tour. That seems pretty fast to me, but I'm curious kind of why.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of reasons. One, it's a thank you tour. I mean, there were so many people all around the world and all throughout the United States that were really responsible for pushing, an end to apartheid, pushing for his release. And so part of this tour is a way to just show his support and gratitude for all of that, the activism that went into getting him released. And then the second part of it is to visit his family. He has children and grandchildren that live in the United States, in Boston in particular. And so this opportunity is a chance to be able to thank people, see his family, tour the country, raise money as well. This is a big fundraising effort, to get more political funds for his campaign for president.
Yeah, for the ANC back in South Africa, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and Massachusetts is important in the first part of that thank you, because it was the first state to withdraw its pension funds from companies that were doing business in South Africa. And this is part of really activating that anti-apartheid movement in the late 1970s and the 1980s is to not just march against apartheid, which was a huge part of the early activism, was demonstrating opposition to apartheid, which during the Reagan administration had, South Africa had full-throated support from Ronald Reagan because it was seen as a Cold War ally. But then to figure out a way to pressure the white government of South Africa to end apartheid and withdrawing funds, sort of a private sanctions regime, was really, really important here.
Hitting them in the pockets was probably one of the most effective tactics of ending apartheid.
Yeah, we weirdly, I feel like we weirdly don't talk about enough or don't sort of remember enough the anti-apartheid movement in this country. I mean, Mandela was in prison for 27 years. The anti-apartheid movement was, a decades-long struggle that, as you're hinting at, evolved, right? And it had moments of political pressure and it had moments of mass protest and it had moments in the end and ultimately I feel like of real economic pressure. I think it defined a whole generation, certainly I think, of activists in this country. And then, I don't know, maybe it just doesn't get talked about because that's how time and history work, but it is interesting. But so do you want to kind of talk a little bit about that? Like we mentioned, a thank you tour. I mean, obviously Mandela felt the support and talked very movingly about feeling the sort of worldwide support. But what were some, especially in Massachusetts, what were some of the sort of tangential things that were going on that were really applying pressure to South Africa?
So NIki had mentioned, taking away the pensions, and sanctions are also a big, part of this, removing financial funds. But I also think that a lot of times people tend to look at the comparisons of like U.S. segregation and South African apartheid and compare the two. And so, there are a lot of activists, American activists, that influenced or had an impact on Nelson Mandela's life. So one of the first few people that Nelson Mandela wants to see is Rosa Parks. And he wants to talk about, how her activism sustained him all those years where he was in prison. He wants to talk about Arthur Ashe, who, is the famous Black tennis player who also used his platform to speak out about injustices. So, and not only that, I mean, when you think about Boston is like, I don't know, this peculiar city in which it becomes sort of like known for the racism of the busing segregation movement in the 1970s, but also it's a place that's like the hub of American abolitionism. There's a lot of duality about Boston that makes it this unique place to come and to visit and meet all of, the Kennedys. That's also like a big deal. So,
yeah, just worth it. That's just a reminder. And we're going to do this actually in an upcoming episode as well. But that, in the 80s and 90s, I mean, Boston as a political center in this country, it's hard to overstate.
When you think about Ted Kennedy, Tip O'Neill, John Kerry as these major politicians who are centered in Boston at the time, but also I think just to underscore what you were saying, Kellie, about Boston's reputation. I mean, one of the most famous pictures, a Pulitzer Prize-winning picture that comes out in the 1970s during these busing protests is of a white anti-busing protester spearing a black man in a three-piece suit with the American flag. And it is hard to overstate how important this visit was for the city of Boston and its reputation to have these multiracial crowds come out and treat Mandela like a celebrity. And we should talk about that too. Like the celebrity that surrounds Mandela is such a big part of this story as well. Here was somebody who had become an icon in the Black political movements in the United States, had been a touchstone, especially for that generation of Black activists coming up after the civil rights movement. So somebody like Barack Obama, who's born in 1961, it's not Martin Luther King and the end of Jim Crow that is the activism that he's involved in. He's a baby. It is anti-apartheid. And Mandela looms so large because he was in prison that whole time. He wasn't somebody who they could see and touch. He has this almost godlike status. When it came to the New York City leg of the trip, this was a time when Dinkins was mayor, and he had as one of his assistants somebody named Patrick Gaspard, who would go on to be the political director for Barack Obama. And Gaspard got to be the person who was meeting Nelson Mandela and showing him around. And he had been, I think at the age of 16, he dropped out of school, or he had just become very active in the anti-apartheid movement. And so for him, meeting Nelson Mandela was this huge moment. And it's pretty impressive that as a young person, pretty low in the totem pole, he got to spend this time with Nelson Mandela, because there was a lot of jockeying to get to be part of these entourages, because Mandela was such a huge figure for so many people.
And his visit was a bit controversial. I mean, simply as we're describing Boston's very tricky history with race relations. But, even in 1990, the year he visited, the president of BU criticized schools for talking about Mandela as a role model. But, to that end, you read some of the reports at the time, and some of them do paint this picture, as NIki was saying, of Black civil rights activists in the United States looking to Mandela, not necessarily looking internally for inspiration. And maybe some of that is a little bit of like ignoring some of the activism that was happening at home. But I mean, there is just sort of this hint of like after the 60s and the first part of the 70s, there's maybe a sort of Black activist vacuum or something, and Mandela is filling some sort of role that MLK filled a generation before.
Absolutely. We need a hero. I mean, I think that's what it sort of symbolized in so many ways, that coming off of, and this is, a couple decades after, King's assassination, but it's still, momentous for people to see someone who's been imprisoned this long has survived and now is on a campaign tour to run for the presidency. I mean, it doesn't get more powerful than that. But I think also it's so funny because I think Boston's always trying to sort of sidestep its racist past. And so you constantly have these fighting factions of those who want to see Boston as this progressive city on a hill and others who want to protect the still very white supremacist agenda. And so those odds are always there. But again, as NIki said, when you see the crowds and you see the hundreds of thousands of people that come out, it really does push back on some of these ideas that people have been trying to escape, which is Boston as a racist city.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could layer on sort of one more part to the Mandela story, it's not until 1965 that people from Africa can migrate to the United States with the change in the immigration law. And so you have a much bigger diaspora community in the United States as well. Black South Africans who have fled the apartheid regime, but also just from countries across Africa. And so having an international Black leader as a touchstone in that moment, I think is important as well as a way of uniting Black activists across the country, whether they were born in the U.S. or whether they were part of this diaspora.
As we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about the visit itself. So Mandela, in his remarks, says, quote, "When one day our history is rewritten, the pioneering and leading role of Massachusetts will stand out like a shining diamond. It was you who supported us when very few knew of our existence, our trials, and our tribulations." And then he also says, "The city of Boston has been responsible for looking after my child," because as we said, a couple of his children lived in Massachusetts at the time. This must have felt very good to Mandela supporters in Massachusetts to hear him say these words. And it really does seem like it was a really kind of special day. I mean, thousands of people waiting. It was apparently very hot that day, packing into a gym. What are some of the other details that stand out to you?
Oh, gosh. When he goes to speak at the Esplanade, over 250,000 people show up. And when he comes to the podium to speak, it takes several minutes for the audience to stop applauding and to stop clapping and allow him to be able to speak. And, if you know anything about like Boston sports, like nothing's probably bigger than like, a championship win, the Celtics win. And that moment felt so much like a championship win in which there is solidarity, in which there are older people, younger people, Black, white, and there was just a lot of solidarity in that moment.
It also was a party. I mean, you had Stevie Wonder playing, you had Paul Simon. It had this concert feel. But
Jackson Brown, you have to mention Jackson Brown, one of my favorites. I know. This is my middle-aged white guy starting to creep out. I have to have Jackson Brown mentioned. But go ahead.
No, I was just going to shout out somebody who was not a famous person, Joan McGlynn, who was a high school English teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who comes to Massachusetts to see Mandela. And she is quoted in one of the articles about this visit saying, "I think it's so great for the kids to have a real hero instead of Donald Trump and Oliver North."
There you go. Two names we've mentioned multiple times in this podcast before we mentioned Nelson Mandela. And maybe it's time to start to correct that. But yes, that's a really fascinating quote.
That's like so classic. I love it.
But that quote also makes me think of, just really starting to paint a picture of how varied and in many ways consuming the anti-apartheid movement was. I mean, you have middle school classes raising $1,000 for a fund to free South Africa. Obviously, we have, big divestment efforts. We did mention some of these musicians like Stevie Wonder and Jackson Brown and Paul Simon. The Paul Simon thing is a little tricky with the South Africa stuff, but nevertheless, like there were a huge sort of the artist community was really big, and it was don't tour in South Africa, don't go to this that casino, Sun City Casino, boycott it. So it's like musicians, politicians, activists.
Do y'all remember too on the Cosby Show when Sandra had the first grandbabies and they named them Winnie and Nelson? Yep. And like that went completely over my head as a kid. But now I'm like, I realized what they were doing on the Cosby Show.
Yeah, but it just, it's a genuine example of what a real civil rights movement looks like. It is everywhere, and it applies pressure in all sorts of ways.
And it draws opposition as well. I mean, we won't get in depth into this at the moment, but there was a pretty strong anti-apartheid movement in the U.S. as well that was centered in the conservative movement. And this is something that I think it's Jeffrey Hart writes about. He was a writer for National Review in the introduction to his book about his activism in the conservative movement, where he was like, for us, the 1980s was defined not by opposition to apartheid, but a defense of apartheid as part of an anti-communism.
Yeah, we should find a hook to get into that. That'd be fascinating. Okay, let's leave it there. That was really great. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, our resident Bostonian. Are you calling yourself a Bostonian? How long have you been in Boston?
I mean, I live outside the city, but sure.
Okay. Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
What we have come to tell you here is our admiration and respect for you. We want to assure you of our love. That the African National Congress has been unbent because of your support.
Radiotopia.